Welcome to all of you, and thank you for sharing part of your afternoon with us. We've got a wonderful guest today. John Avlon is a senior political analyst and fill-in anchor at CNN, appearing on New Day every morning. Previously, he was the editor-in-chief and managing director of the Daily Beast from 2013 to 2018. He's the author of several books, terrific books, but he's here today to share his insights from his new book, Lincoln and the Fight for Peace, which each of you will receive a copy of following this event. John's going to discuss how Abraham Lincoln's unfinished vision for repairing the breaches caused by the Civil War might offer us some keys to ending our nation's current extreme partisan conflict. Following his comments, we'll open up for the conversation for Q&A, and you can either use the raise hand feature or direct message to Liz Morrison, and we'll put you in the queue. John has an early connection, long connection to No Labels. So John, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back talking with No Labels. I helped found the organization more than a decade ago with Mark McKinnon, and of course Nancy and a whole bunch of other folks. And at our launch at Columbia University, actually waved a join or die flag, which I still have in my office, and have a mug as well, which remains very core to my vision of the country and where we need to go. And I know it's close to No Labels' heart as well. I think a lot of things that motivate folks to join groups like No Labels and to identify polarization and hyper-partisanship as one of the primary dangers facing our democracy has been validated in recent years. It's gotten worse since the organization was founded, despite our best efforts, because a lot of the problem is structural. But one of the reasons I wrote about Abraham Lincoln is, first, it's a reminder that we've been through tough times before as a country. We've been through more divided times. That's not to say that our difficulties aren't serious and dangerous. They are. And I think one of the things, the perspective that history teaches us, is that when our politics devolve to this tribal vision of politics, rooted in identities that seem wholly at odds with each other, when we stop being able to reason together and instead resentments and divisions and hates start to define our politics, that's an existential threat to democracy, because it can lead to not just polarization, dysfunction, and division, but destruction. Violent polarization. We've experienced that in our own country before. And while the context is different, and while I think we have every reason to not fear a second civil war, neither should we be sanguine about how this is always the way it is. All those rationalizations you hear about the divisions we're dealing with today, because it's not how it's supposed to be. It's not how it's always been. It's characterized some of the worst times in our history, and we should have the wisdom to draw on our history to know that we can't do that again. Lincoln, I think, remains a uniquely unifying figure, despite the fact that he presided over a civil war. And one of the reasons that I wrote this book, Lincoln and the Fight for Peace, which you all will get a copy of, is that, after writing about Washington, my last book was on George Washington's farewell address. And after writing a book called Wingnuts about extremism in American politics, and Independent Nation, which is a history of centrist leaders in American politics and how some succeed and some fail, the flow through line's always been the same, just taken at different approaches. It's how we combat, confront, overcome hyper-partisanship and polarization. These forces and political figures who conspire to divide us and lead to, I think, America being less than it's capable of being at its best. The issue is that history provides us an opportunity to talk about politics without directly wading into current politics. It offers us perspective, which is the thing we have least of in our politics. And Washington, I wrote the book in the wake of, the Tea Party, and a time when a lot of people were misappropriating the founding fathers for their own ideological and partisan purposes. And what I found is that Washington and his fellow founding fathers, many of them, warned against the dangers of what we would call hyper-partisanship. And it was a reminder that Washington himself wrote a memo to us, to future generations, about the forces that could destroy our democratic republic, and hyper-partisanship was chief among them. Of course, Lincoln comes on the scene in the next generation, as the founding generation is faded. And even as a young man, he saw the dangers of tribal politics, of division, of not dealing with the core contradiction of slavery. As a young man in his Lyceum speech address, he said, "As a nation of free men, we must live forever or die by suicide." And of course, when he assumes the presidency as leader of an upstart third party, that's the danger. The founder's worst fears and his worst fears were coming true. But I think it's Lincoln's approach to politics that offers us so much hope, despite the fact that he was a man of peace in a time of war. From a perspective of people who recognize the dangers of divisive politics, Lincoln is a reconciler in a time of radicals and reactionaries. He's somebody who has a tough mind, but a tender heart. He believes in the politics of the golden rule, which is something we have lost sight of, treating other people like you'd like to be treated. And that view extends from his arguments against slavery to his belief in reconciliation with the South after winning the war. He believes that decency can be the most practical form of politics, but that people are more likely to listen to reason when they're greeted from a position of strength. He's not a pure idealist. He understands there's no substitute for victory in elections or on the battlefield. You know, if he lost the 1864 election, none of his words would matter, and we wouldn't remember him today. But as a matter of character and temperament, that was the secret to his success. He's a temperamentally moderate man, but he combined moderation with moral courage. And I think, as many centrists and moderates in the organization need to understand, I think that is the way to be a reconciler. That is the way to be an effective centrist, is to combine moderation with moral courage. It's not, I think, crucially, about compromises that split the difference on great moral issues. One of the hallmarks of Lincoln's leadership is that he focuses on great goals. And then he's willing to be enormously flexible with details to achieve those goals. His basic prescription for winning the peace, when he negotiates with Confederates, and he envisions how you win a peace, is unconditional surrender followed by a magnanimous peace. He understands that for example, when Confederates come to him and people are clamoring for a peace deal, and he says he will not accept a ceasefire before surrender. That seemed intemperate to some folks, but Lincoln was focused on the larger goal. He was concerned, rightly so, that if he agreed to a ceasefire before surrender, that there would be backsliding on an end to slavery for all time. The political will would go out of that. And then the root cause of the war wouldn't be addressed. So I think that's there's so many aspects of Lincoln's political leadership strategy that are important for those of us in the center of the political spectrum. But that's an example. He is perfectly content to achieve transformational goals by transactional means. He doesn't make the perfect enemy the good, but on the big things, that's the horizon he steers towards. The spirit of magnanimity is equally key. And we can get into this in great detail. But it's the promise of magnanimity after surrender that makes it all possible. Lincoln's core insight is that, in a civil war, and there's never been a civil war on the scale there was in the United States, but his core insight was that you couldn't simply pound your opponents into submission and salt their fields. You had to find a way to live together again after war. And so what Lincoln understood is that you don't really win the war if you don't win the peace. And so he's thinking about this for years in the middle of the war, which is difficult to do because the natural gravitational pull is toward a spirit of revenge. But Lincoln doesn't give in to that. He's thinking about reconciliation. He's able to imagine a future that's not captive to the pain of the past or the present, for that matter. He's able to start setting up policy structures that he believes will help the nation grow together again after the war, from Transcontinental Railroad to Homestead Act to land grant colleges, by moving the nation's focus west rather than north-south, and creating a structure for economic growth that he thinks will help depolarize the nation by giving people in a sense of investment in a shared prosperous future. He's laying the groundwork for that, even in the middle of the war, as a matter of practical policy. His words are powerful, particularly the last paragraph of the second inaugural address, where he lays out a road to reconciliation, but it's his actions that are even more powerful to the people alive at the time. One of the stories I recount in the book, he goes to the front lines in the last few weeks of his life, partly to make sure that troops remain on offense. His generals talk to Grant and Sherman and Porter about his vision for a magnanimous peace and give them the most liberal and honorable terms. Let the rank and file, let them have their guns to shoot crows with, he says, and let them have their horses to plow their fields with. He does not want amnesty for the upper echelon Confederates who should have known better, members of Congress, the courts, the military who joined the rebellion. He doesn't want them to be able to reclaim their power quickly, but for the rank and file Confederates, he wants liberal and honorable terms. And as evidence of that, beyond his wishes that he prescribes to the generals, he's touring a field hospital. It's called the Depot Field Hospital. And for those of you in Virginia or in the area, it was City Point, Virginia, which was renamed Hopewell, but was the final U.S. Union headquarters of the war. And he's touring and he's greeting all the Union soldiers, and he's an emotional man. You know, one of the, I think, things about Lincoln is that he combines opposites, and he greets these soldiers, and he is so horrified by war and what he knows, and he bears moral responsibility for it, he feels. So he's hearing their stories and shaking their hands, and he's getting ready to leave after hundreds and hundreds of beds. He sees another 10 out back, and he asks the doctor who's touring him, he says, "What's that over there?" And the doctor says kind of imperiously, "Oh, you don't need to worry about that. Those are just wounded rebel soldiers." And Lincoln says, "That's exactly where I do need to go." And he goes back and he shakes all their hands and he looks at them in their eye. And in the stories, even decades later, that those ex-Confederates tell, many of them break down. It's a critical turning point because they realize they've been fighting for a lie. They've been told that Lincoln is a butcher and a tyrant, you know, King Africanus I, but they realize that he's a kind and good and decent man, and that he genuinely wants the nation to find a way to live together again. And it makes a deep impression on them. As Lincoln's actions do, it's a portrait of a peacemaker in his personal example. And what he's trying to do is steer the nation towards a horizon of reconciliation. He knows it's going to take time. You know, those of us who are not ideological or utopian, you know, we don't think you can remake society. And we know you can't remake human nature, but you can adjust incentive structures. You set an example. The power of your example, particularly in times of power, can help adjust a culture, change a culture. And that's what Lincoln was doing towards a very clear goal. And I think that's one of the reasons his example endures. The simple power of showing that kindness can be consistent with effective leadership made an enormous pressure on his acolytes, who carried forward, you know, the gospel of Lincoln. I think sharing him of some of his interesting deficiencies as a person. But it was that spirit of love that infused him, that willingness to try to depolarize difficult debates using humor and logic and scripture. The fact that we forget sometimes, I think we've remembered again, that character is the indispensable quality in a president. In any person, I'd argue, but particularly in a president. Nothing else matters. Not formal education, not even obvious preparation for the office. You know, not only is Lincoln the upstart leader of a third party, but he has no executive experience. He's got one term in Congress. He's got no military experience, but he has character. And that's rooted in the qualities of his personality: empathy, honesty, humor, humility. And out of that personality, those personal qualities, come his principles. From that come his politics and his policies. And that's the way most people are. And I think it's not a matter of finding another Lincoln today. It's really a matter of looking for people with a similar spirit. And I think particularly for those of us in the center who are trying a way to overcome the divides in our society before they turn destructive, even more destructive. I mean, violent polarization. I think Lincoln's example is as powerful, perhaps more powerful now that it's been in a long time, because he taps into that American grace. We know that his vision works. It has the power to inspire. It has the power to galvanize. It has the power as a member of the second founding to create a common ground for a shared history of the United States that people can buy into. And it's a powerful reminder that our most effective leaders are not on the ideological extremes. They're people dedicated to reconciliation, not radicals or reactionaries who end up driving our country further apart. And the fact he was a politician is an asset, not a demerit. That he was willing to negotiate, not on, again, he was going to be uncompromising on core principles and big goals, but on everything else, he's going to be enormously flexible. He's going to help his opponents save faith. He was going to try to find a way of empathizing with them as a means of reasoning with them. And he had the credibility that comes from a reputation for honesty to do it. He had the humor that could be very disarming, even in negotiations. And he had moral humility. And that's another thing I think we are missing. Very often when people come to political debates armed with what they believe to be the right side of the equation, they forget that moral courage does not communicate moral superiority. That approach itself is alienating. And that's, I think, one of the things about the second inaugural address, which itself is a speech about the war as collective punishment for the original sin of slavery. Even though there's no moral equivalence to the North and the South, Lincoln does not divide us into us against them. He never does that. He doesn't let the North rest easy in the sense of moral superiority either. He says, we're partly responsible for this too. And then in that final paragraph, he pivots to that vision of grace from the Old Testament to the New Testament. He says, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, which itself has a very gentle reminder that no one person can claim to exclusively know the will of God. The idea that there's work to do. We've got to roll up our sleeves and do the work. And the goal is to achieve and cherish, i.e. appreciate a just and a lasting peace. And I think we've failed to cherish the hard-won victories in our politics. We have not sufficiently taken our democratic republic. I think we've taken it for granted at times. I think we've taken the liberal democratic order set up for us in the wake of the Second World War for granted. Now we're recognizing that cannot safely be taken for granted either. But that was a result of a generation learning the lessons of Lincoln finally and imposing unconditional surrender followed by a magnanimous peace. And the result has been 75 years at least of a just and lasting peace and prosperity in the European continent, which many of you will know is not the history of that continent or any continent. In any case, I really want to spend the bulk of our time in conversation, but I've been so heartened by the reaction to Lincoln and the Fight for Peace. It's an unexpected Lincoln book in some respects, as no one had really focused on his vision for how you win a peace. But I was very gratified, and I think many members of No Labels would understand why, seeing that the New York Times headline on this was a Lincoln for our polarized times. And that's in many respects what I set out to do. So I'd love to take a whole bunch of questions and have a great conversation with you all.
Great, John, that's wonderful. I look forward to reading the book. Let me take, please, if you have questions, direct message to Liz Morrison or raise your hand and we'll get to as many as we can. Let me take moderator's prerogative and ask a question. John, you've studied history, you've written about historical figures. I think it's fair to say that in America, we don't teach history the way perhaps we once did, or people have so they don't understand it at all, or they have a view it through the lens of presentism or wokeism or something else. Do you have thoughts about how we can equip citizens to bring, a balanced
Yeah.
perspective of history to life?
Good. Well, first of all, we should begin by teaching history again and civic education again. We have cut civic education in American history from our curriculum to our great peril, because particularly a democracy such as ours, one of the things that makes America unique in the world is that we're the only nation founded on an idea, not a tribal identity, right? And Lincoln understood that as well. That's why our patriotism is far different than mere nationalism, right? That America stands for something bigger than itself. And our success, as Lincoln said, is not for ourselves alone. That requires buying into the idea. And it requires, therefore, teaching a shared sense of history. Now, that sense of history will and should evolve, right? And that's where we are having debates about politicized history right now, and some folks who've cautioned against it are happy to do it when it's to their ideological benefit. History is to some extent a debate that never ends. There are facts, however, and we shouldn't ignore that. But we need to prioritize the teaching of American history and civic education again. I think it's most likely to begin with patriotic philanthropy on a local level. Gilder Lehrman, for example, does a great job of this, and I recommend them. But I know Chris Coons has a bill looking at this. It's a bipartisan bill, not surprisingly, but this is something that really needs to be prioritized. I think part of the reason we've gotten into trouble in recent years is that we have not adequately taught American history or civic education. This isn't a spectator sport. Self-government is not a spectator sport. And you need to know the rules, and you need to have common facts. And that's where things start to fall apart. What I'm passionate about is not only the telling of American history and the story of American history, although I am that. And I think that comes from being the grandson of immigrants, where, you don't take America for granted. You don't take this country for granted. And I think immigrants make us all better Americans because of that. That sense of a civic religion that my family communicated to me because they appreciated America was so animating for me. But I'm also interested in the idea, and that's what this book is of applied history. What are the lessons we can learn? It's not simply dates and dates and names. It's what's the useful wisdom we can learn? What works? What doesn't? And that's a point that George Marshall won when he won his Nobel Peace Prize. He talked about how we can stop wars, one of which is in effect applied history. We need to study the circumstances that led to wars from a non-partisan, non-sectarian perspective. And that indeed is part of the point of this book, is what are the best practices for peace? We studied war all the time. We don't really study the actual processes and policies and principles that can lead to just and lasting peace, however inherently dynamic that is. And that's part of the point of this book. One final point about history, I'll tell a story about Lincoln. There are endless great stories about Lincoln, and certainly one of the speeches he gives on the way to his inauguration is about he stops in Trenton, and he talks to them about how the example of Washington crossing the Delaware, which was just down the river, so to speak, had inspired him as a young boy. And he got a sense from reading books of the founding fathers that there was something more than common, he said, about the American Revolution. That America has a responsibility beyond itself to the rest of the world. The theory of our government is universal freedom. What we're offering is an experiment in democracy. And that's why he took that challenge so seriously. The other story is from the fall of Richmond, which is the centerpiece of my book, the opening scene and the thing I spend the most time on. It's one of the most dramatic and cinematic moments in American history, and it gets really short shrift, even in multi-volume Lincoln biographies. But basically, Lincoln enters Richmond 2 days after the fall. The city is still smoldering. The Union has barely secured the city. He goes in on a longboat. He doesn't have a big army behind him, and he's not met by a military escort. He's got a handful of sailors, an admiral, and he's got his son Tad holding his hand on the boy's 12th birthday. But as they make their way, he sits in Jefferson Davis's chair and walks through the city and is thronged. You go past the Libby prison, which was a horrific prisoner of war camp. It was a converted tobacco warehouse in downtown Richmond, but used to hold Union soldiers, kind of second to Andersonville, in terms of the horrors, but it was a notorious place. And Lincoln points it out to his son, and the crowd yells, "Tear it down, tear it down." And of course, the easiest thing to do, and usually a sign of bad leadership, is to agree with the mob. Lincoln doesn't do that. He raises his hands, quiets them, and says, "No, leave it as a monument." And I think why that's so profound is that not just the easy thing to do is to agree with the mob, but he's saying we cannot safely erase our history, even if it is comfortable to do so. We need to learn from it, confront it, and learn the right lessons from it so we are not condemned to repeat it. And that itself, I think, is an elegant Lincoln anecdote about the importance of teaching history.
John, that's wonderful. Thank you. So first question will be at Talmadge, Boston, and on deck.
Oh,
is Michael-
Talmadge.
Howdy.
Michael Small's on deck. Talmadge, tell us where you're from and ask your question.
I'm from Dallas, Texas, and had the privilege of meeting John last week while I was in New York City. But John, you mentioned the word magnanimity and how that is a central theme in the book. Obviously, Lincoln's words, especially in the second inaugural, amplify that virtue. But from your research, what were the other important sources of information that you kind of had a light bulb moment to help you better visualize Lincoln's magnanimity?
Talmadge, as it applies to his vision of Reconstruction, or more general, his disposition and how it was shown in key moments of his presidency?
You could go either way. Just that character trait, whether at the end of the war or just throughout the war, whichever way you want to go with it.
Well, I'll answer it both ways. I mean, one constant point is that Lincoln, this is a time of red meat politics, and it was then too, right? Easiest thing for any politician to do in any era is to play the divide to conquer, us against them game. And notably, Lincoln, who had deep, profound philosophical disagreements with slavery, rooted, by the way, and I would argue, among other things, in the Golden Rule, but the entire free soil, free labor philosophy of the early Republican Party, which was a moderate progressive party at the time, was rooted in that basic magnanimity. There was something fundamentally unjust and unfair about slavery on a human level, that he took care to not, though, demonize people in politics, in public or private. That impressed me. The fact that, here's a guy being called every name in the book, being disrespected and being demonized, but he never responds in kind. He says everything from, I will disagree with people on politics, but I won't question their patriotism or their principle. I'll question their judgment. That he instructs the members of his State Department not to speak ill of the Confederates. That even in private, he calls Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee Jeffy D and Bobby Lee. It's a little dismissive, but it's basically familial. It sends the message this is a familial fight. In the second inaugural, his final speech, he does not engage in triumphalism, not once. He knows he's going to win the war by that point. Once he wins re-election and Atlanta falls, it's a matter of time. But he does not do that. He does not play the us against them game. And consistently, in ways big and small, he sets an example. And he comes under a lot of criticism for it. When his wife's sister visits him in the White House, after the death of her husband, who's a Confederate general, dies in the Battle of Chickamauga, they come under enormous fire. Why are you sheltering Confederates? The sister-in-law refused to take a loyalty oath to the Union before spending weeks in the White House. But it was a reminder that this was a family fight, and that you needed to extend yourself with a spirit of forgiveness and love, even to people who you've been fighting with. And that ultimately those personal qualities, Talmadge, are reflected in his policies, in the famous speeches, but presidential proclamations that lay out a vision of of Reconstruction as well. But for me, it's the stories. For Lincoln, it was the stories too, as he spoke in parables. But those personal examples are what set the preconditions. And I think that what also gave his words credibility.
Thank you.
Great.
Sure.
Michael Small and then Roy Vela is on deck. Michael, tell us where you're from and ask your question.
Hi, thanks, Doug. Hi, John. Michael Small from Chicago.
Michael?
I'd like to turn it to the present time a little bit and ask the same question from two perspectives. When Joe Biden ran on for the soul of the nation and tried to play on a lot of themes that you were just describing, and he's kind of sorry, got a dog barking here. He's kind of hasn't gone so easy for him in a lot of ways. From the flip side, Abraham Lincoln, history has treated him really well, but was it just as tough for him in his day at that time, and maybe wasn't treated so well?
Oh, odd, yeah. I mean, look, remember, I mean, he may be a reconciler, and remember, it's his first inaugural. We must be friends. We are not enemies. We must be friends. We're called the better angels of our nature, called the mystic chord of memory to draw upon us. That's not enough to stop secession and civil war. The mere fact of his election, they sparked an insurrection. He was considered an illegitimate president. And he was widely hated and dismissed and disrespected in his time. And not just by in the South. I mean, papers like the New York World, which were pro-Southern, pro-Confederate in New York, were viciously critical of him. I mean, it's not that he didn't face difficult headwinds, and indeed, a lot of his legislative success is predicated partly on the fact that the Southern Democrats left. So all of a sudden, Republicans had a working majority. The obstruction for a lot of policies that Republicans have been trying to put through wasn't there as a practical matter. The Southern Democrats had tried to basically take advantage and mildly rig the rules of Congress in order to give them disproportionate power. 3/5 compromise over slavery was an example of that. They didn't have black representation, but they got credit for it when it came to apportionment. So we've had these wars against majoritarian and multiracial democracy from the beginning, and partly, by the way, those folks were driven by demographic panic. It's worth recalling. But Lincoln faced enormous headwinds. He was deeply despised by people. Indeed, many Republicans also criticized him for not being radical enough. They called him weak and timid and vacillating. And the success he had in Congress, despite often being at philosophic odds with the radical Republicans in his own party, was in part because a lot of Southern Democrats had taken themselves off the table, and so numerically they weren't an obstacle. But even in the course, particularly as he laid out a vision for Reconstruction, he was facing great difficulty. He couldn't even get the delegation for Louisiana seated because radicals and reactionaries conspired to block it because they wanted to control Reconstruction. It's kind of a weird story, and it's a little bit of a rabbit hole, but it's important because his final speech is largely about Louisiana as a laboratory of democracy, as a laboratory of Reconstruction. And they had passed a state constitution which abolished slavery. It made progress on a lot of issues. And as a result, they were entitled to seat an elected member of Congress. And Charles Sumner, radical Republican, got together with a couple of sort of, peace Democrats who were still in, so-called peace Democrats who were still in Congress, and refused to seat the delegation. And this really drove him crazy. John Hay, his Lincoln's secretary, used to call the radical Republicans Jacobins after the French Revolution. I mean, there are a lot of fights in Congress, a lot of vicious disrespect. He was not considered a successful president by many of his contemporaries. You had radical Republicans like Benjamin Wade actively hoping he'd be assassinated before Reconstruction took place. And it's just a reminder, it's blessed are the peacemakers because they'll catch hell from both sides. But ultimately, character does matter, and it helped. He won re-election, so he had a political mandate. In August, before he's reelected, he writes a letter to his cabinet predicting his own defeat. And if he had lost that election, that would have been it for Lincoln and the nation. So a lot of his success is predicated in our eyes, not just upon his assassination, which elevates him, but on the mere fact of his reelection. So these sorts of headwinds of popularity and legislative obstacles and polarization are nothing new. I will say on the fights within his own Republican Party, which are instructive for our time, and some of the criticism that Lincoln comes under today, I often recall a quote from Frederick Douglass, who said, from a genuine abolitionist perspective, he said, Lincoln could be seen as tardy, cool, and indifferent. But from the perspective of American politics and the sentiment of his fellow countrymen, which a statesman must consult, he was zealous, determined, and radical. And that seems to be about the right balance. He's coming under criticism from the radicals in his party. He's coming under enormous, unprecedented obstruction from reactionaries. And yet his goal is to create sustainable change. And that's what he's able to do. He waits 2 years to get the Emancipation Proclamation. He works to end slavery in the border states legislatively. He won't allow ceasefire before surrender, and gets the 13th Amendment and makes its ratification as a condition for the Southern states' free admittance to the Union. So it sticks. He's very wary of going too far too fast, but he's the one who gets it done.
Thank you. Next up will be Roy Vela and then Doug Fays on deck. Roy, tell us where you're from and ask your question. Roy, if you're there, you're on mute.
As you just mentioned, Lincoln did not issue the Emancipation Proclamation until 1863, deep into the war. Why did he delay? What happened to the issue of slavery when men were dying during the war from 1861 to 1863? And where does this fit into your narrative about Lincoln's character?
Sure. Great question, important question, and relatively easy to answer. So remember, Lincoln at the beginning is making the point over and over again that he does not believe the presidency has the constitutional power to end slavery. While he is personally opposed to it, as a political matter, he is merely opposed to slavery's expansion, which the Compromise Bill, the Kansas-Nebraska Act by Stephen Douglas, allowed. That was the thing that got him back into politics. And it's a reminder that even from a centrist perspective, that bad compromise bills can sometimes compound problems. That did. The cause of the war is slavery. Slavery creates the context to end, the Civil War creates the context to finally end slavery. But at the outset of the war, remember, you've got 5 border states that have slavery, but don't join the Confederacy. And so you get to this issue about not moving too far too fast in a way that could actually harm progress. If Lincoln had said at the outset of the war that this war would be about ending slavery, rather than simply restoring the Union and standing up to the concept of secession, right? Which he says is the essence of anarchy, which of course it is. You can't go from the ballot to the bullet, lest anybody forget. That he needed to make sure those border states did not join the Confederacy, as they very well could have done, Kentucky, Missouri, et cetera. At the outset of the war, those first several years, there are a lot of upsets. The strength of the Confederacy is underestimated. but he is constantly working to get those states, in particular Missouri, to end slavery through what was recognized as legal constitutional means, through state votes of the state legislature. He succeeds. And indeed, one of the notes he carries around in his wallet on the night he died was about an editorial about Missouri ending slavery and about the radicals saying that, he hadn't moved fast enough to do it. It's when the war has gone far enough and Union soldiers and Black Union soldiers are getting involved, which, by the way, is a critical turning point in the war and America's attitude about race. That's when he puts it forward. And it's a strategy, right? Remember, it's enacted on January 1st, but it's announced several months before. And it's designed to basically say, and it's incomplete. It's a wartime executive order and applies only to slaves in the seceded states, which is why Lincoln feels an enormous amount of urgency to pass the 13th Amendment, because the Emancipation Proclamation isn't enough. He knows that. But it's enough to galvanize support, increase pressure, and with 180,000 Black soldiers, who are fighting in Union Blue, really helps become decisive and gives the war a moral character beyond simply restoration of the Union. And that carries through to his reelection and to the passage of the 13th Amendment, which then removes the root cause of the war. So that's the reason for the sequencing. It's exactly what we're talking about. You cannot go too far too fast, or it can be counterproductive to the cause of progress. And so he sequenced it in ways that caught a lot of grief for a lot of the abolitionists at the time. But again, he got it done. He was able to bring the country along, but only because he was cautious of not moving too far too fast. He had to make the case and bide his time and then move decisively. So it's an object lesson, I think, for us all.
Next up is Doug Fay, who will be followed by Charles Lamar. Doug, tell us where you're from and ask your question.
Yeah, hi, I'm from Kirkland, Washington, a suburb of Seattle. And this is for John, but it's really for everybody, I think, on this call and throughout America. And not to put you on the spot or anything, John, but are there any people on the American political scene today that you think have those qualities that are necessary of character and so forth?
Character, sure. I mean, look, let me begin by saying, the book's been out for just over 2 weeks, and I get that question whenever I talk. We should not be looking for another Lincoln, right? Hey, again, we've been through far worse times, and it's important to remember that Lincoln was unique in his time too. I mean, he's our greatest president, but he's bookended by two of our worst. But by any measure, Buchanan and Johnson are terrible presidents. And they Johnson in particular is an object lesson on how not to win the peace. But what I do say is we can look for people with a similar spirit. I do think that it's very clear that character is the number one quality we need to look for in a president. If they have any other sorts of appeal or claims that they don't have character, it's not going to work. And that's not to say you need, perfect's never on the menu, right? I mean, let's be, clear-eyed about that. And again, Lincoln had his faults, many of which were exaggerated by his opponents, some of which were in the Republican Party in his time. But in terms of character, kindness, there are many. There are good people serving in politics, believe it or not. You may disagree, with many things, or be disappointed by Biden with regard to the delta between hopes and execution. But I don't think many people fair-minded would say that he's not a kind man or a good man. That's one thing you hear from his Republican colleagues in the Senate consistently. I'm not saying that Joe Biden is another Abraham Lincoln. I'm simply saying that he is a kind and good man, and that matters. You list all sorts of other associated problems with him without denying that. I think Adam Kinzinger has shown enormous character. So does Liz Cheney. Might disagree with elements of their politics, but that's really irrelevant to the larger questions of who's willing to take the risk of character to stand up for democracy against the mob, in that case, in their own party. I think people on the periphery of politics, like Admiral McRaven, have that similar spirit. I think Joe Neguse and Jason Crow I think a number of the veterans who are serving. I think Mitt Romney. I think really the only bright line for me is for political purposes, you voted to overturn an election or pretended or actually bought into the big lie. That's a disqualifier for me on anything resembling the Lincoln tradition.
Thanks. Charles Lamar, and we'll then do Jim Westra. Charles, tell us where you're from and ask your question.
Yes, Charles Lamar from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. My
Mitch
question,
Landrieu. I should have mentioned Mitch Landrieu. I know he's further south, but he's
Bill Cassidy too? Yeah.
yeah. I think Bill Cassidy's done it. Yeah, I think he's been a man of character, no question.
My question is, if Lincoln had survived and avoided assassination, do you think he could have steered the country through a middle ground of advancing civil rights for the ex-slaves and reconciliation with the Southern white population?
Great question, important question. And, I must say, the book does not do the sort of what if version of history because, but that's a perfectly reasonable conversation. It's just not too profitable to put in a book. Yes, I mean, my core belief and contention is that if you trace his statements from his speeches to his letters to his comments to his generals, I mean, that parallel path you just said, he wants to move towards equal rights, voting rights, a multiracial democracy. I mean, Louisiana, a lot of the book actually is to do with Louisiana politics in the 1860s, which itself is a fascinating and into the 1870s, a little depressing, but really important. He wants to move the nation simultaneously towards reconciliation with rank and file Confederates, welcoming them back into the family, without empowering the planter class and the Confederate leaders who should have known better, while simultaneously saying that we should move towards equal rights and voting rights, for African-American men. And as he says, he understands it's a process, but he says, beginning with the very intelligent and our military veterans. And while that sounds sort of miserly, that is a significant statement from a sitting president. Nothing like that had ever been said before. And indeed, John Wilkes Booth is in the audience when he says it and says that's the last speech he's ever going to make. The question is, and if you look at what Johnson did, he got it perfectly wrong, right? I mean, on the one hand, he is offering pardons to all sorts of Confederate leaders, partly because he likes being flattered. He empowers ex-Confederates to take over governorships, and then it acquiesces to the passage of the Black Codes. He vetoes the Civil Rights Act, dismantles the Freedmen's Bureau, opposes anything resembling voting rights for former slaves. And it is, a person of his time and motivated by enormous bigotry, but he gets it perfectly wrong, gets in a fight with the radical Republicans. They bring, troops back to the South and then he offers a, blanket amnesty for all Confederates and we're off to the races. Grant briefly gets us back with the Anti-KKK Enforcement Act enforced by a Southern Attorney General, Amos T. Ackerman, which I think is an inspired move and quite effective. But I do think, look, there are legitimate questions about how would Abraham Lincoln have dealt with the Black Coats, because he's been very clear in his final speech that, he has a high degree of latitude for a Federalist version of Reconstruction. Every state's going to have the tone and temper and timeline that fits it. He wants people to buy in ground up on a local level. He understands that it's going to look a little different in each state. As long as they meet a couple of broad, inflexible principles, particularly state constitutions that end slavery and, pass a ratification of the 13th Amendment. Those are table stakes for him. So I tend to think that he would not have allowed the Black Codes to take place, because as a lawyer and as someone steering those directions, I know he wouldn't have offered blanket amnesty to Confederate leaders. You can tell that just by looking at his own writing and Reconstruction proclamations that he put out as president. But to the vast majority of Confederates, rank and file, I mean, one of the stunning things I found was an interview, pretty obscure interview with Jefferson Davis towards the end of his life. And he said, the death of Abraham Lincoln was one of the worst things that could have happened to the South. And indeed, you saw that sentiment, from folks who realized not only did his assassination take that spirit of magnanimity and take it back to one of revenge and recrimination, but that he had a feeling for the people of the South and wanted to invest in rebuilding the South, and to do it in a spirit of kindness. He said, I don't think we are going to reunite the nation in a spirit of hate and resentment. So he would have had a lot of challenges, obviously. And in certain contemporary lenses, you could say that the Radical Reconstruction's vision of the future is more aligned with, where we are or want to be today. But I think Lincoln would have been able to walk that line. He was clear he was going to adjust his policies based on facts on the ground. And I think he would have been nimble on some of those things that either tripped up Andrew Johnson or Andrew Johnson willfully made worse. Answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, John. We'll have time for just a couple more questions. If anybody has one, you can raise your hand through the system, but we've got Jim Westra. Jim, tell us where you're from and ask your question.
Thank you to Jim Westra from the Boston area. John, great presentation. Thank you. Looking forward to reading the book.
Thank you.
My question is really the flip side of Doug's question. You use a lot of terms to describe the character traits of Lincoln: gentleness, kindness, empathy, moral courage, respect, fairness, magnanimity, ability to compromise. Those traits are not usually associated with the most vocal members of either party these days, although I would certainly grant your point that I think Biden is a good and kind man. What is it about, I guess my question is, could Lincoln be elected today? And if not, what is it about our party structure, our media coverage, our election process that does not enable people with these character traits to become more prominent and successful?
Sure. It's a great and important question. And it gets a chance to talk about some of the issues that I know many of y'all care about and I care about. So first of all, Lincoln, again, his rise to the presidency at a time of civil war is so unlikely. Remember, the Republican Party is an upstart third party. The Whigs have died. The Know Nothing Party briefly emerges. Lincoln's comments about that, by the way, are extraordinary. He's very pro-immigrant and more than doubles the number of immigrants during the war. But he is freakishly tall. He is from the West. He is virtually unknown. He's got no military executive record. One of the things I found that constantly made me laugh is a shocking number of people, when they write about first meeting Abraham Lincoln, say that some variation of he's the ugliest man I've ever seen. and he jokes about that as well. But when he talks or starts telling a story, there's something that animates his features that becomes enormously compelling to people. Look, you have a partisan press at the time, so it's not, it wasn't for lack of, partisan papers, but just simply in the Republican Party at the time is a moderate progressive big tent party. And they nominate Lincoln on the basis of his oratory, his failed Senate campaign. Right now, one-term congressman who lost the Senate race isn't get elected president anyplace, but he's the moderate candidate. When they go to Chicago for that convention, Seward is considered the favorite, but he's seen as too radical. So they go from the more moderate young candidate from the West. It's a 4-person political race. So that itself makes it kind of crazy. He's around 40% of the popular vote, but he wins decisively, but do succeed in transforming the campaign to a cause. There are so many twists in the process of his election. It's the most unlikely thing in the world that you wouldn't believe if it was a work of fiction. But I do think that the incentive structures in our politics are such where, the moderates in the parties are not usually elevated to the top tier. Certainly not the Republican Party. Otherwise, your Charlie Baker would be the world's most logical presidential candidate. Right. The two most popular governors in the country, governor, two most popular governors in the country the last several years are Charlie Baker and Larry Hogan. Right. They have like 70, approval ratings that approach 70% as Republicans in blue states. In a rational political system, they would be the top tier of everybody's call for who could be the next president. Instead, they aren't even talked about in Republican circles as potential candidates. Larry Hogan would desperately like to be talked about, but and that's a real structural problem. And so the party is not elevating the people who can reach out and have a record of winning over the reasonable edge of the opposition, or let alone a record of success in governing. And of course, that also stems or is reflected in the rigged system of redistricting and the decline of competitive seats. And I do believe, I am of the opinion that it goes back to election reform. You change the rules, you change the game. Our incentive structure is rewarding the worst behavior. It's not rewarding people who want to go to solve problems. And so the way to do it is some combination of redistricting reform, open primaries, and ranked choice voting. If you did that, the incentive structure is entirely different. It would actually result in candidates trying to reach out and solve problems. And I think that's of existential importance right now.
Thank you.
We are near the top of the hour. So John, do you have any last thoughts you'd like to share?
Well,
with the
I'll
group?
take that. There's at least one other person. I'll try to do a lightning round because I know one guy's been at least he's on my screen patient.
Yep, Roy.
I'll do lightning
Yeah,
round.
sorry. And I was supposed to talk before, and Wi-Fi decided that what I had to say wasn't valuable and flicked me off the Zoom.
All right.
So just very quickly, you had mentioned truth and how do we? I'm just wondering, as a political analyst and as a person active in this space, how do we get to any sort of existential truth when we allow both media and social media to espouse opinion as truth? Do you have any opinions in that regard?
Well, other than yeah, I appreciate the circularity of the question there too. But look, there's a story that Lincoln used to tell that I think is important in this front. And it's the Wolf's Dictionary. And it was one of the things that frustrated Lincoln at the time as a lawyer and someone who took words seriously. He said, we don't have a common definition of the word liberty. Because remember, the South and the Confederates always said they were fighting for liberty, right? Now they're literally fighting for slavery. It's embedded in their Constitution. There's Alexander Stevens, if you haven't read the Cornerstone speech, this isn't subtle, this isn't complicated, right? Their government's predicated on the idea that all men are not created equal. But they say they're fighting for liberty, and a lot of people buy into it, some still to this day. So Lincoln tells a story about it at a Baltimore sanitary fair. And I love this story. He says, we don't have a common definition of liberty. For example, the shepherd who guards the sheep and bats away the wolf is praised as a liberator by the sheep, but he is denounced by the wolf as an oppressor of that wolf's liberty. Plainly, the wolf and the sheep have a different definition of liberty, particularly if the sheep is a black one, he says. But he also says that I believe we've gone a long way towards repudiating the Wolf's Dictionary, which is to say that words have meaning, facts exist, that people's opinions, when they, in a fundamentally self-interested way, try to twist facts or words or meanings to their ends, that we have an obligation to say that everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. So we've got to repudiate the Wolf's Dictionary and do it without being afraid that we'll be called, biased on one side or the other. You got to have a bias towards truth and fact. And that can come with a sense of compassion and empathy for people who we disagree with as a means of reasoning to them. But some things are basic, like defending democracy, like that idea that Moynihan articulated. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion, not their own facts. And I think particularly for those of us in the center, it is incredibly incumbent upon us to play that kind of a constructive, clarifying role in debates and not simply degenerate to, well, everyone's got their own opinion. Guess we'll never know what's true, because some things are true. And it's incredibly important that we have all people who tend to be less self-interested in their political approach. What's good for my team, your team, that it's even more incumbent upon folks who try to put country over party, who do put country over party, to speak clearly about those things, and like Lincoln, repudiate the Wolf's Dictionary. So,
John, thank you for your time. Thank you for your thoughts. Thank you for the book, and we look
Thank
forward
you.
to reading it.
Enjoy it, all of you. Thanks, all.
Good week.
Do well.
Take care.